Hi, this is Main Street Rob, and today I'm a little bit of an armchair Rob. And I guess the reason I'm doing that is because it's going to be hard to do a village walk throughout all of Eastern Ontario and some parts of Northern New York. So today, armchair Rob. What I wanted to tell you is that this is like the first video of a series that I'm going to do on Crysler. And I think it's a very interesting one because what we're going to do is we're going to look at kind of like the historical arc that exists around the village of Crysler. We're going to talk about how the land was settled, who shaped it, and how Crysler keeps reinventing itself. Well, this story about Crysler is not really one about its mills and about its general stores, or even about the founding of Crysler and the families that were associated with that. It actually begins decades earlier, during the conflict of the American Revolution in 1776 to 1783. During that time, and actually after 1783, there were thousands of displaced families who had supported the British during those American Revolutionary Wars, and they fled to Canada. They came here for land. They came here for stability. And they came for a new beginning. This was a remarkable time in Canadian history. 20% of all Canadians can trace their genealogical background, their roots, if you like, to the Loyalists of this particular time. Pretty impressive. Here we are, almost 40 million people. What we're talking about is 8 million people in this country can trace their roots to the Loyalists. So these Loyalists, while they supported Britain, they did so at huge cost. And it was pretty obvious because there was a division even among neighbors. Neighbors were fighting against neighbors. And the way that they conducted these wars was that houses and barns would be razed, crops would be burned, and people and livestock would be killed. Some of them, of course, were captured and kept as prisoners for the Loyalists in northern New York, for example. Those prisoners would have been taken all the way over to Niagara. And a number of people actually died, not only in Niagara, but also in getting there, because this part of northern New York, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, was really the wilds. So who were these Loyalists? Well, they came from diverse cultural backgrounds. And some of them were what they call Palatine Germans. Some of them were originally from Scotland that had emigrated to the New World. The same, Irish. And this is in Eastern Ontario, the people that came here. If you look at who went to the Maritimes, it was an even more scattered distribution of backgrounds, including many of the blacks who were enslaved in the United States or had just gained some kind of independence to get away, who settled in Canada. Many of these folks had carved out prosperous homesteads in the years that they had been in the Americas, particularly in New York and Pennsylvania. So what kind of an impact would these loyalists have on the existing country of British Quebec, British Canada, if you call it? Well, at the time, let's say in 1782, there were about 90,000 people in all of Quebec, another 10 to 15,000 in the Maritimes, so roughly 100,000. So Statistics Canada tells us that there were roughly 50,000 loyalists who came to Canada after the Treaty of Paris, 1783, and actually up to and before that time. 10,000 of those came to Eastern Ontario, and another 30,000 actually went to the Maritimes. So you can imagine the Maritimes, they tripled their population. But this was a significant number of people, and I think it was way more than the British had ever anticipated. But the thing about it was that Britain knew there were going to be loyalists coming. They knew they were going to be coming from the Americas. And so they restructured all of British Canada. What they did was they created two provinces, I'll call them provinces. One, Lower Canada, which is Quebec. The other one, Upper Canada. The Maritimes they left as it was. But in Upper Canada, what they did was they established a whole new land tenure system, unlike the seigneury system that they used to have in Quebec, which was really an extension of the old feudal system. And under the land tenure system they were putting into Upper Canada, it was the same as in the Americas where these loyalists were coming from. And what it meant was that you could buy, you could sell, you could lease, you could do whatever you wanted with your land. It was a freehold system, as they called it. Changing this land tenure system, it was a significant impact on the land system in Upper Canada. So the British knew as well that after 1783, they were going to have an influx of settlers. But what they really wanted to do, first of all, was to establish a land system that they could reward the military people that had fought for them. And so they created something in Eastern Ontario called the Royal Townships. And I think I've talked about this in other village walks, but the townships could have been named Matilda or Williamsburg or Honestbrook, which was where a lot of German settlers were. And so these 8 royal townships were created to look after 2 of the disbanded groups of soldiers that had fought with the British. One was the King's Royal Regiment of New York. The other one was the Royal Highlanders. These folks were to be given land first. The interesting thing about these 8 royal townships is that today's the county of Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry basically includes those 8 townships. So the British had instructed the chief surveyor of Quebec to get out there and survey these royal townships. About 200-acre parcels. And if you can think of it, they were about 5 times as long as they were wide. And That meant that they were roughly 2 kilometers long, slightly less than half a kilometer wide. And the idea was that let's put them this way, that the short sides would be parallel to the river, to the St. Lawrence River, and the long sides would be kept for things such as road allowances. So today, if you think about it, the short sides, the top and the bottom, they represented concessions. So this could be concession 1, concession 2, and so on. And today, if you look at anywhere in Eastern Ontario, you are going to see these rectangular grids. And I've got 2 examples here I'm going to show you. One is the area just north of Morrisburg. And it was one of the early maps. But what you can see is that the rectangular grid applied. Concessions, some kinds of roads every now and then. And the interesting thing is, if I take a map of Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry today, and I look at the Crysler area, guess what I see? The same pattern. It's exactly the same. So you could go almost anywhere in Eastern Ontario, and if you follow a concession, you know you're going roughly parallel to the St. Lawrence River. This process is what I guess can only be termed a tightly organized military style operation. And the amazing thing about this was, because the land was so wild, if you like, it was the surveyors who actually took people out to show them their lots. So picture these folks that have been waiting to get their land, having gone through wars and having a very emotional time. Finally, they get a surveyor who takes them out to their land. And what do they find? Dense forest. I mean, today we look out there, there's a lot of farms. But in those days, it was tree after tree after tree. And there weren't any roads to speak of. And there was little support of any kind. And supplies were very, very scarce. The British hadn't really anticipated the volume of these loyalists coming back to settle in Canada. What they did was they gave them all a tent. Here you go. They gave them an axe. They gave them some seeds. They gave them some blankets. And they said, here you go. They were definitely not prepared. Some of them immediately reacted, and maybe reacted before this happened. They took their land grant and they said, I'm going to sell this. Or maybe they traded it for another portion in a different part. Some of them just said, the heck with this, and they abandoned the lots entirely, in which case they went back to the Crown. Many of these loyalists still persevered. So you have the names that are very prominent throughout Eastern Ontario, and in the Crysler area we have Crysler, Johnson, MP, Curry, Stewart, a whole bunch of McMillans, McLeans, McDonald's, every imaginable type of Macs. So what the British did, though, was they tried to have some of these cultural groups kind of stick together. So when we were talking about Lunenburg, for example, and the area around there, that was very much a German heritage site. And in other parts, like in Finch, you had the Scots. And it was clever that they did that. And of course, there was a certain comfort in knowing people of the same kind of cultural background. These families had a really hard time, but they persevered, have remained the backbone of this part of the country. The Chryslers were one of the most influential families. I guess the first and oldest Chrysler was Philip Chrysler, John Chrysler's father. Philip grew up in an area called Schoharie, if I pronounce it properly, County. It's called the Mohawk Valley. If you've been to northern New York, if you're near Albany, you're close. He came with his family from Germany in 1710. There were a host of Palatine Germans. These folks were under that feudal banner that we talked about. They were farmers, and there was a horrible drought. And with that drought, the farm owners pushed these guys. And the British decided that they would help these German farmers by giving them free passage to the New World. His parents came over in 1710. There were 3,200 Palatine Germans. 475 of those people died en route. It was horrific. They were very, very hardworking farmers. In the same area were the Iroquois Confederacy. In fact, if you look at Philip and his brothers, they grew up in a community where there were natives and German Palatines, and they adopted many of the skills that the natives had. Philip was a very enterprising man. At one point in time, Philip owned 12,000 acres of land. By 1740, this area was one of the most prosperous areas in all of New York. So this is where the story starts to get a little more interesting, because when the Revolutionary Wars broke out, these Germans in particular looked at it and said, "A minute, the British settled me here. They got me going. They brought my family over here from Germany in the midst of poverty and drought. Who are these upstart rebels? I'm going to support the British." And so they did. Philip's brother Adam, the stories around him are basically legendary. If you're on the British side, you may think that he was a bit of a hero. If you're on the American side, he was reviled. Philip and his brother were very much engrossed in the war. Adam in particular worked with John Butler's Rangers, but Philip also joined Butler's Rangers. He had a small group within it, and he actually felt it was a good thing to have his two boys, John and Geronimo's. John was 10 at the time, and Geronimo was 12. They became drummers for Butler's Rangers. Well, there are lots of stories about the campaigns that existed and the battles that were fought during the Revolutionary War. But suffice to say, in my view, it is what you might call guerrilla warfare. There was a constant raid, if you like, of settlers' homes, settlers' farms, settlers' crops burned, and then a quick retreat down native pathways that would take them back to Niagara. Niagara became the center for Butler's Rangers to attack in northern New York. When the war ended with the Treaty of Paris, as it was called, the Crysler family had all of their lands and buildings confiscated. There were many of these folks that had been imprisoned that were released, but there was no way that anybody who had supported the British could go back. And so the Chryslers fled to Canada, first to the Niagara area, and then eventually to Williamsburg Township, where they received their land grants. And of course, because of Philip's military, he received early land patents, as they were called, well before those land boards. And he established himself and his family in the Morrisburg area. And he died, actually, and sometime around 1795. No one seems to know when exactly he died. But his farm and his holdings were well established and taken over by, among others, I guess, then the family John Crysler. He was 27 at the time of his father's death, and he had already emerged by that time as a very successful businessman. He'd built general store, taverns, mills. He had incredible ambition, and he's the man that would eventually shape the settlement plans of a good deal of Eastern Ontario, but very much the history of the village of Crysler. And in our next series, we're going to talk about John Crysler in more detail. We're going to talk about how he ever accumulated the amount of land he had, and you'll be surprised to see where his lands were. I hope you enjoyed it. This is Armchair Rob today. And if you enjoyed this, maybe you can hit that subscribe button. But in any respect, stay tuned for the rest of this story about Crysler. See you next time.